My boss is usually great, but once a month things get a little hairy. Part 1. Gerald Bishop was the doctor you called when you needed immediate medical attention but didn't want to go to the hospital. It's not that Gerald had failed out of medical school or had botched up a surgery or something like that. Gerald was quite a capable and sober doctor. It's just that years ago he had met somebody who presented an opportunity to him, and the money was quite good. He could make more in 3 nights than he could an entire year if he'd kept his old job at the hospital. I was Gerald's assistant. If the phone rang, it meant that somebody with a lot of money was in trouble. We had a few different houses that we preferred to work out of, but we were also willing to travel. There was a decommissioned ambulance for local trips and Gerald's airplane for long-distance trips. All travel expenses naturally were reimbursed. We didn't discriminate. If somebody came in with a gunshot wound, we didn't ask where it came from except to get a clearer picture of how best to treat it. If a celebrity came in with something jammed up his rectum, and that happened more than once, we got it unstuck and sent him on his way. We were on call 24/7, though mostly we worked in the dead of night, and there were only 12 nights out of the 365 where we weren't on call. Any other night was fair game. It didn't matter if it were Christmas or if Gerald were in Europe on vacation with his family. Sometimes I'd have to treat the clients myself while he walked me through it over video chat. But we always answered the call, except for those 12 nights. Those nights were the full moons, and we couldn't answer any calls because I was watching over Gerald and his wife in their basement where they were bound in silver chains because they were werewolves. They could control their urges most any other time except when the moon was full. Then they would send their 2 kids to a sitter and call me over. I'd come over with gun with silver bullets in it they had given me. If one of us gets out, shoot us, Gerald told me on that first horrifying night. If you can, shoot to wound. If you can't, shoot to kill. It's okay, William. It's the agreement that Mary and I came to. Then I'd chain 'em up. The transformation was hideous. Bones shifted under the flesh as the bishops writhed around in seemingly unbearable pain. It was as though an invisible force were pulling their faces away, contorting their nose and mouth into a snout. I watched their teeth clatter to the floor as sharp fangs poked their way through bloody gums. Shit Eric slashed around the faces of the bishop's prostrate clients. Here were others that were slashed and pulled in a ballet of horror. Instinctively, I pulled the trigger of the gun the first time I witnessed it. The safety catch was engaged, so no bullets came forth. The transformation took less than a minute, but it would haunt my nightmares for months, as would the rest of that night. Eventually, as with most horrors, I would grow used to it. But not for a long time. I sat in a chair in the opposite corner of the basement, near the stairs, and watched the bishops all night as they raged against their chains, howling in pain each time the silver dug in. I prayed the whole time that the chains wouldn't break loose. If they did, I knew that I would likely be dead, silver bullet or not. The night seemed endless, but at long last it did end. As the first hints of dawn crept in through the daylight windows, the beasts bent down, scooped up their human teeth, and swallowed them. As their bodies underwent another painful transformation, they slumped to the ground and lost consciousness. It was the night of a full moon when our business line rang, and I declined to answer it. It was the first time that anybody had actually tried to call it during a full moon, as we spread news of our night off throughout our networks of clientele well in advance each month. The phone kept ringing. I pulled it out of my pocket and looked at it quickly as the two beasts raged and howled on the other side of the basement. The call was from Salvatore Sartori, a man who was almost certainly a mob boss. I declined the call and set the phone to Do Not Disturb as Gerald gnashed his wolf fangs. The next day, we were informed that Salvatore's son had been shot in the stomach and was bleeding out when he'd called us. We could have probably saved him, but we didn't, and he died. A few days later, we got a call from Candace Hart while we were on the golf course. She was an assassin for hire, and we had treated Candace and her friends for various wounds over the years. When she called that day, she sounded hysterical. And Dennis, I said, slow down, you're not making sense. A fucking werewolf got Melissa, she said breathlessly, ripped her fucking guts out. A werewolf? I asked. Gerald looked at me with a frown. Look, whatever's going on, can you meet us at the spot in 15 minutes? I'm already there, said Candace. Fucking hurry. Then she hung up. Did she say something about a werewolf? Asked Gerald, throwing his 9-iron into the bag and getting in the golf cart. She did. She said it eviscerated her partner. Is that even possible? During the day? It is, said Gerald. Call her back and tell her to meet us at the other spot. But that's a half-hour away from where she is now, I said. If the attack happened near where they are, and it probably did if her partner is still alive after getting gutted, then the wolf is probably close by. By the time we get there, we may have company. So the first priority is to get them further away. That also gives us time to prepare for them. No time will be lost in the end. I called Candace back and told her the new plan. She wasn't happy about it, but agreed. 15 minutes later, Gerald and I were at one of our houses, prepping for surgery. You have the gun, I assume? Asked Gerald. He had ordered me to always carry the gun with the silver bullets in it, in case he turned unexpectedly. I nodded. Better give it to me, said Gerald. I have a bit of experience here, sadly. I pulled the gun out of my travel bag and handed it over. He tucked it into the back of his waistband. Jesus fuck help her, she shouted. She looked shaken, more shaken than the time she had driven herself to her house with a bullet wound in her chest. She jerked open the rear door to her car. I looked inside and saw that Candace's account of Melissa's condition had been accurate. Melissa was moaning in shock, manually holding her entrails inside her opened-up abdomen. The three of us lifted her carefully onto the stretcher and carried her inside. What happened? Asked Gerald. It was a fucking werewolf, said Candace. Werewolves aren't real, said Gerald. We set Melissa on the operating table. I strapped her down and then injected her with the anesthetic. Look, said Candace, we were hired for a hit. They didn't give us any intel on the targets beyond an address and photos, just said it had to be done today. For big money. So against my better judgment, due to Melissa's urging, I agreed. So we get there and take out 2 of the targets, no problem. But the 3rd target, she turned into a fucking werewolf right in front of us. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And she did this. Candace pointed to Melissa's prone body. Is she gonna make it? Gerald reached in and began rearranging Melissa's guts. I don't suppose you know her blood type. Of course I do, said Candace. You think we're amateurs? It's AB. I went to the refrigerator, got a packet of AB, and began preparing the transfusion. She might make it, said Gerald, shining a light inside of Melissa's abdomen. Or she might not. You don't seriously expect us to believe that you saw an actual werewolf. This looks more like a clean wound from a very sharp blade of some kind. The organs are all intact. I was not experienced as Gerald was, but I could see that what he was saying wasn't true. It did indeed look like a wild animal had attacked Melissa. The cut itself was clean, but the organs had been mauled. Look, said Candace, believe me or don't believe me, just get my baby fixed up, okay? That's when we heard a banging coming from the back door. Who the fuck is that? Cried Candace. I was about to ask you the same thing, said Gerald. Did somebody follow you here? The police, maybe? Were you speeding? Driving erratically? Again, I'm not a fucking amateur, said Candace. Anyway, whoever it is, I'll take care of them. She pulled a gun out of her boot. I'll do my job, you 2 do your jobs, right? Before Gerald could answer, we heard a wild animal howl coming from just outside. I watched Candace as all of the color drained from her face and was replaced by a look of pure terror. It's here, she whispered. Right. Gerald rubbed his temples as the banging resumed, accompanied now by a series of low growls. Then he pulled the gun out from behind his back. We heard the sound of the door splintering apart and something stepping inside. I panicked and grabbed a scalpel, though I knew it would be useless. Only the silver bullets in Gerald's gun would do any good against a werewolf. I forced myself to breathe as Candace and Gerald lifted their guns and pointed them at the doorway to the room. Shooting them doesn't work, whispered Candace. Not even a headshot. It's a fucking werewolf. I told you it was. I heard the sound of claws scraping against the hardwood floors, getting closer. I thought briefly about injecting myself with morphine, just so that my death would be less painful. No, I tried to convince myself. It's okay. Gerald's one of them. He can handle this. But when I looked at Gerald, he looked far from confident. More composed than Candace, or what I imagined I myself looked like, but not calm. And Gerald was always calm, even the day he had handed me the gun for the first time and told me to shoot the wolf version of him should it escape from the chains. The wolf was just around the corner, and then before I could process what was happening, I saw it, in the doorway, a flurry of hair and claws leaping through the air at us, howling. I closed my eyes in preparation for death and heard 2 gunshots ring out. When I didn't die, I opened my eyes. The wolf was on the ground, bleeding out from the center of its head. My God, I heard Gerald say. What have I done? That was... The wolf twitched once and then stopped moving. Once it was dead, it began to transform back into human form. From where I was, I could only see the back of the head, but I saw that it was a woman. Candace was standing closer. Yup, she said. That's the bitch we were supposed to kill. We got her kids, but then she turned into a fucking werewolf. But it looks like we finally got her. So, do you guys believe me now? And can you fix Melissa?" I took a few steps closer and looked down at the dead body. It was Mary Bishop. Part 2. My boss is great, except when he turns into a werewolf and kills everyone. Gerald turned in an instant. It wasn't like a full moon when he and Mary had struggled against the transformation, when it was as though they were trying to will each bone, each hair follicle to stay in place, and failing to do so. Gerald wasn't fighting his wolf nature anymore. He was embracing it. And how? Candace was able to fire off an impotent shot from her gun before Gerald lunged at her and sank his fangs into her shoulder. He lifted her then with his jaws off her feet and flung her against a wall with the flick of his neck. She collided with a shelf of medical supplies, which all went clattering to the floor as she cried out in pain and shock. She slumped down, clearly injured and terrified, but still conscious. I eyed the gun with the silver bullets that Gerald had dropped to the floor when he had transformed into a wolf, but I stood frozen, too afraid to make a move, too unsure of what move to make. He had just found out that his children had been murdered, and then he had shot his own wife dead. I could understand the man's rage, but it wasn't a man that I was encountering. The beast that was Gerald let out a low growl and jumped up onto the table where Melissa was still strapped, with an open wound across her abdomen, exposing her guts. Gerald clamped down on a string of intestine in his mouth and yanked violently, tearing it apart. A foul stench spread across the room, as did a spray of blood and half-formed fecal matter. Melissa didn't stir, as she was still under the effects of the anesthetics. No matter what she had done, I was grateful for that. Her screams would have made it harder to think, and it was already hard enough to think. I saw an underarm crutch hanging on the wall and reached for it while Gerald was distracted. I thought that I could use it to slide the gun over to me without getting closer to the dangerously furious wolf. Gerald was ripping into Melissa's neck now, pulling her esophagus out. I kept my eyes on that scene while I grasped the crutch and lifted it off the hook. It was difficult to watch. I'd seen most any medical procedure you can imagine, but those always happened under controlled conditions. Here now was a wolf tearing into a human being, tearing at the flesh, pulling away organs, flinging them away, and then going for more. Behind this scene, I saw Candace grasp onto a shelf and pull herself to her feet. As soon as she did, Gerald whipped his head around and let out a howl. Then he leapt. I reached out with the crutch and tried to drag the gun to me, and Gerald dug all 10 claws on his hands into Candace's neck. I succeeded in pulling the gun a foot or so closer to me as Gerald pulled Candace's head off of her body. He held it up above his own head, howled again, and then dropped it with a sickening splat. Then he turned to face me, growling. I dropped the crutch and he dropped to all fours and began stalking towards me. "Gerald," I said, "it's me, William. It's over. You got your revenge. It was well-deserved. Now please, come back." Gerald bounded through the air and impacted me, knocking me to the ground with his impossibly heavy weight on top of me. He bit into my shoulder and tore a chunk away. The pain was unbearable, and I screamed out, "Gerald!" He stopped mid-lunge, with his terrifying maw hanging open. He leaned his face into mine, his pink eyes inches away from my own, his hot breath stinking of meat. Then he closed his jaw and began sniffing me with his snout. Please," I muttered. Then he turned and ran out of the room. I dressed the wound on my shoulder while I tried to think about what to do. The burning pain made it difficult to focus, but I was eventually able to gain my bearings. Salvatore Sartori. He must have put a hit on Gerald's family as payback for us not saving his son's life. That was the only thing that made sense. So now Gerald was almost certainly on his way to perpetuate the cycle of revenge. I looked down at Mary's dead body and couldn't blame Gerald. But he had given me clear instructions on what to do if he ever was unleashed to the world in his transformed state. If you can, shoot to wound. If you can't, shoot to kill. I scooped up the gun with the silver bullets and headed out the door. Sartori was usually at his restaurant just out of town. When he required our services, that's where we went, down to the basement. So I figured that was probably the first place where Gerald went. Though I'll admit I didn't know how it worked. Can werewolves remember and reason? Either way, that was the only thing I could think of to do. When I got outside, I saw that Gerald's car was still in the driveway, meaning he'd taken off on foot, or paws, or whatever those horrible and sharp appendages were called. He was incredibly fast, had gotten a head start, and could travel places where cars couldn't, but there was still a good chance I could get there before him, if I sped. The only question was if I wanted to get there before him. Sartori had ordered the death of his wife and children. He deserved to die. For that reason, I decided not to speed to the restaurant. Well, for that reason, plus the fact that it was hard to focus on the road, the pain in my shoulder seemed to be spreading out, setting my body on fire. A werewolf bit me, I thought. That can't be good. After a few minutes of driving, I arrived at Sartori's Italian restaurant. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but no signs of activity until I heard the gunshots and screams coming from inside. I decided to let Gerald finish his business. I got out of my car and sat crouched behind it, the gun clenched in my hand, aiming at the front door. I figured I had one shot and one shot only. I would aim for the thigh if I could. Gerald had given me shooting lessons, and I'd gotten fairly proficient, but I knew that it would be hard to hit a target capable of moving so fast with any kind of precision. I crouched there for what seemed like a long, dreadful time as my fear mounted and the gun became slick with sweat. Then the door to the restaurant flew open, and there was the monstrous wolf, dripping in blood and gore. It dropped down on all fours and started sniffing the ground, giving me the perfect opportunity for a targeted shot. I tried to aim the gun, but I couldn't. My hand was shaking. I grasped it with my other hand as well, though that was weak with the pain spreading out from my shoulder. I clenched my jaw and tried to steady myself as Gerald continued sniffing the ground. Then he looked up, directly at my car. I started to squeeze the trigger, aiming in his general direction. That was the best I could do. Suddenly, I saw a flash of silver, and Gerald's wolf head came flying off its body. I released the trigger and watched in horror and confusion as the head hit the ground with a thud. The body remained standing for several seconds, convulsing, before it too dropped to the ground. Then the head and body transformed back into their human forms. I stayed crouched down, trying to figure out what had happened. Two men emerged from behind a jeep. One had a gun pointing at Gerald's corpse. The other walked over and picked something off the ground. "Damn, Jameson, you've got pretty good aim with that thing," said the man with the gun. I looked to see that Jameson was holding some kind of silver brooch. Yeah, well, if I'm being honest, the thing kind of has a mind of its own. Do you think it will work, Clarence? Against the big one this Friday? "I sure as shit hope it does, kid," said Clarence, rolling Gerald's severed head over with his foot. Never seen this one before. These fuckers are coming out of nowhere in droves." "That's bad, right?" asked Jameson. "Well, it's good for business," said Clarence, bending down to pick up Gerald's head by the hair. He stuffed it into a duffel bag that he had around his shoulder. "But in general, if you're asking in general, whether it's a good or bad thing that we've got a shitload of werewolves coming out as we get closer and closer to the full moon, if you're asking in general whether it's a good or bad thing that the big one is coming, well, Jamie, I'd have to say that it's a very bad thing. In general, now help me with the bod." I watched in helpless horror and confusion as the two men dragged my friend's body over to the trunk of the Jeep. They hoisted him in, then they got in the front and pulled out of the parking lot. I have been locked inside my house for the past 2 days now. The pain at first spread throughout my body until I couldn't move or think. Then it was gone, replaced by an incredible alertness and feeling of vigor. A thick patch of hair has begun to sprout on my shoulder, at the spot where Gerald bit me. I am, without a doubt, turning into a werewolf. The full moon is in 5 days.
That's the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down your views. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing, so you may not miss any video in future.